and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, we have a topic that Gareth volunteered, and it's a topic that I am eternally fascinated by, and that is the topic of dealing and managing with crises.
Yeah, so crisis management is a discipline in itself, but I think we've, over the past couple of years, talked about a lot of tactics and ways of dealing with change that we're probably going to delve into in this episode as well, because I think a lot of what we espouse is about adaptation and about resilience, especially in a increasingly uncertain world. And we've obviously done quite a few episodes now looking at things like Boyd's OODA loop and what is strategy and why strategy is different from just simply having a plan. I think all of this kind of feeds into how you can prepare and then what you do once you face what in the military we would call a 2.4 moment.
Come on.
A 2.4
I've not
moment.
heard of a 2.4 moment before.
So when I say in the military, this is probably a land forces thing, so it's an Army and Royal Marines thing, but there is a planning process for tactical planning that we call the 7 questions estimate. And it's 7 relatively simple questions that lead you from what's the mission to what's my plan. And we might one day
do that.
do an estimate of that. Yeah. But it's really simple things. So the first one is, what is the situation and how does it affect me? And it was created as a kind of framework to take complex problem sets, difficult things that you've been asked to do, help you, particularly when you're tired, stressed, there's a lot of uncertainty, turn it into a workable plan with the constraints of capability that you have. And then to turn it into a set of orders, and there is a NATO standard for how you produce orders, to them to be able to communicate that plan to those people that you need to go and do it.
I love how you've made that sound so very simple and straightforward. But
well,
today's not the discussion about that.
I think we should do a whole episode on planning estimates and how they work, because it's a very military thing that I think could be really useful. However, in typical military fashion, something that was a very simple framework, here are 7 questions that you can learn off by heart. So you don't even need to have any tools. You could just get your notebook out and do this. People have then made amendments to it. And so now there are decimal point questions in between the questions. And 2.4, so question 2.
Can I just check? Does that imply there is question 2, question 2.1, question 2.2, question 2.3 in order for there to be a 2.4?
Yes.
This no longer sounds simple.
Well, absolutely. And this is a very military thing to do, isn't it? Is to take something that works and then try and make it better and make it more complex.
But it's a very, I mean, we're diverting already and we're only a couple of minutes in, but it's a very human thing where you say, I see something that's simple and I think there's more value if I now go to a next level of detail, to the point where one day you've lost the beauty and the simplicity of you can be in a ditch, it's dark, and all you have to do is look at these 7 questions and you'll be all right. Now all of a sudden they're getting their torch out and go, Sergeant, my batteries have run out. I'm on 2.5 and I can't see.
Yes, exactly that. So the decimal point questions are sub questions. And of course, with all these things, you can always just revert back to the simpler model. But question 2 is, what have I been asked to do and why? What have I been told to do and why? And that and why is probably the more important piece, especially when we get into talking about mission command. But the 2.4 is the point where, because you've taken a simple premise and overcomplicated it, you've probably been doing it so long that the situation has changed. So 2.4 is, has the situation changed?
What, since the beginning of 2?
Yes, exactly that. Has the situation changed, and therefore and effectively you're asking, is my mission still valid? So this is what in the military we would colloquially call a 2.4 moment, which is where
Yeah.
something has changed that means normal is no longer normal.
Well, let me. So we used the term crisis at the beginning, and I think it's helpful for us to talk. What do we mean by crisis? Because one person's crisis is another day's average person at work, day at work, and vice versa. So, without us getting to 2.7, what do you mean by a crisis? What makes it a crisis as opposed to something that happened today, perhaps a little unexpected, but it's not the same as a crisis?
So there are three types of change, I think, that broadly can happen. One is a change that you were anticipating that you've got a plan for, which means all you need to do is
Go to plan B.
go to plan B. So the fire alarm goes off. That isn't a crisis. That is a indication that you need to do something different to what you were doing.
Yep.
The second type of change is one where you haven't got a plan and the change has happened, but you have enough resource, information, confidence, knowledge, experience, all of these things, such that you can manage that change. So fire alarm goes off and there's a chip pan fire. You've not practiced how to deal with a chip pan fire, but there is,
Two people have done it before.
yeah,
Someone grabs a blanket.
there's a blanket handy, there's a sink in the corner, somebody grabs the blanket, soaks it, chucks it over the chip pan. We have dealt with that thing. That is not a crisis. The third change is one where the change either happens so rapidly that it breaks your OODA loop. We've talked about OODA loops before, but for anyone that hasn't listened to those previous episodes, it's a concept around decision making that effectively is observe, orient, decide, and act. And there's a whole episode on why it's slightly more than that. But effectively, if something is changing faster than your ability to observe, orient to it, decide what to do, and act, then you're not going to be able to deal with that situation effectively. Or the change is so dislocating that you don't have the resources or don't know how to use the resources to respond to that crisis.
So I really like that. And the thing you haven't mentioned, which is implied, is that it has significant impact. And so, for example, if someone says we haven't got any tea today and nobody knows where the nearest shop is, that is not a crisis. The chip pan fire, it could become a crisis. In this case, we described it isn't. But then there are various other examples we'll come back to. I want to give one example, which I think.
I was going to say, I just think that's a very fair point because I didn't say it's a change that has a consequence on your operations. And you're right, that's sort of implied.
There's a level,
but it absolutely has to be. So those three types of change, yeah, absolutely. There are three types of change that are changes on your ability to operate in whatever context.
Here's an example which we did a couple of episodes ago, the wisdom of the bullfrog, and in it we talked about Admiral Bill McRaven, not Richard.
Yeah.
Just in case he's listening again. And that, by the way, that's a joke from a number of episodes ago. Sorry that we're now stretching jokes across episodes. But in it, he talked about the assault on the Bin Laden compound to attack Bin Laden. And as part of that assault, certainly in military circles, famously, one of the helicopters, there was an accident.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it was hot. There was sort of different conditions they were expecting, and also, if I remember rightly, it was a different kind of helicopter where they didn't quite know how it behaved. Anyway, the helicopter crashed, and not only did the helicopter crash, but the helicopter was part of the deployment of troops to very specific parts of the compound in a tactical situation, and maybe we'll touch on sort of strategic or tactical. In this tactical situation, you could imagine this might have been considered a crisis. The reason why it was not a crisis was precisely as you've laid out, because Admiral McCraven talks about how the SEALs had planned for 368 eventualities.
Yeah.
One of which was, if helicopter crashes, these 6 things will happen, and we will be briefed on it and we will plan for it. So to your point, they actually had a plan, something that could have been a crisis. And I think there's an element of how do you prevent crises, which I'm sure we'll come on to as part of dealing with it. That's a really good example. So before we came on, we sort of talked about what kind of crises might we talk about as sort of exemplars. And I wonder whether it's useful for us to start with maybe an example like COVID.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, we're recording this now at a time where there are significant wildfires out of control in Los Angeles. That is a very, very good, tangible example of a current crisis. And that's a crisis because, as I previously said, the situation is changing so fast, it is outstripping the authorities in LA and Southern California, their ability to respond effectively. Now, that's not a slight on them or their ability to prepare. That is simply scale and dynamic change. So that's a crisis. Now, that's a very fast-moving natural disaster. COVID is a really good example of a global crisis that arguably, in some contexts, you could say was very fast-moving. But actually, I would say was slightly slower moving in dynamism to a wildfire. What was interesting about COVID was its exponential growth. And that's something that as humans we're just not very good at understanding. So what seems like something that's under control today is rapidly spinning out of control tomorrow because the numbers have leapt up so quickly. And even though you were tracking it, it still took you by surprise.
Well, also, I think for COVID, it was the unprecedented nature of this. Even now, if you were to say for nearly a year, we hid at home and all businesses operated from within typically their houses, except some, we wouldn't have believed that it was significant. But
that's a really good point, because when you talk about a pandemic, and I happen to have been involved in at a very low level, when I was in the military, in looking at some of the military support to civilian authorities, so what we call MACA or MACP, which is military assistance to civil powers, response planning to a flu pandemic in the UK, and how the military might help roll out vaccines and set up primary care facilities and do things to alleviate the second order consequences of a pandemic. So I had a little bit of experience in sort of planning these things. But I think what's interesting, pre-COVID, you talk about a pandemic as a medical crisis. What COVID was a across the board crisis. It was a financial crisis. It was a social crisis. It was a medical crisis. It was a logistical crisis. It was a legal crisis. And ultimately it resulted in a trust crisis between societies and their governments. And we saw a huge explosion in misinformation and changing narratives, and fed into a lot of wider issues. So COVID's a really, really good example of where, if you look at the problem on the face of it, you would think about what those second order effects might be, and you would miss the much deeper vein of crisis that is bubbling underneath.
Well, I also want to make sure we usually in these episodes we take something which is large, and obvious and often unusual. And I'm always slightly worried that people will be listening to this going, yeah, but this isn't me. I mean, the classic one is we give military examples,
Yeah.
and someone in the civilian world says, but I'd never do that. I don't have a gun
I mean,
or
that
danger.
is literally what this podcast is about.
But what I like about the example of COVID was that it was a really good example of it affected everyone. But also it's important to say that as we talk about crises, as is typically the case, the example we give is not just about the most extreme case.
Yeah.
One would hope we're not going to have a COVID example again in the next few years. However, you sort of, if you think of it as a sliding scale, you go down a sliding scale, and there is a car company which all of a sudden has no electric vehicles and is now thinking there is an existential threat and we don't know how to deal with this. There's a crisis. There's a company that says the opposition have just come out with a new piece of software and we don't have the ability to react quickly. So I think this idea of crises, while I have talked about some degree of dimension and seriousness, as with always these things, I think it's really valuable to take it from the most global and serious impacting through to you walk into the office one morning, and this has happened to me on a number of occasions. I think it's the nature of software, and the software that you host for customers stops working and you don't know why it's not working.
Yeah.
And customers are in a critical situation because of it. We only have to think about Cloudflare, which was a really good example of both a very local that could have affected a business with 3 people, but was a globally. So please don't take this as this is a really interesting academic conversation about global crises. This is really any crisis.
I think that's a really important point, and I think actually you've touched on something that's quite important in that wildfires, that would be a crisis to anybody if you were in that vicinity. Global pandemic, that is a crisis to anybody. We're also talking about things that are localized or specific to a sector or a particular business. So when you talk about, the opposition, competitive companies have brought out a new product and it completely undermines our current line of products, that could be a crisis if you're not prepared for it. If it is now meaning that you are hemorrhaging money and not able to make a sustainable profit without significant change and you don't know how to, then that might be a crisis. It's a very localized crisis and it's specific to your organization, but it's a crisis. These could be crises to an individual. And I think the way that we think about crisis and crisis management and crisis planning is scalable. There's a really good military example, and I suspect a lot of the military examples that I may or may not end up talking about in this episode are going to be combat, crises, taking casualties, coming under fire, I don't know, losing positions, whatever. All of that kind of fighting stuff. But there's a really interesting one right now, which is the Chinese government have just announced the progress they're making on 2 new fast jets, gusting 6th generation fast jets. This is at a time where the US are working on their successor program to their stealth bomber. So the B-21 Raider has made some significant progress, and they've just announced that. And there is the successor programs to the F-22 Raptor, which is their most high-tech and comprehensive 5th generation fighter. The British, Italians, and French, I think, are working on a new replacement for the Typhoon. The Russians, who are absolutely bogged down and, hemorrhaging money and people in a war of their making, and, there's no sympathy here, have found themselves in a position where they are losing the competitive edge in air technology. And I read an article this morning about the Russian plane maker Sukhoi pushing out a post on Telegram, a Russian social media site, about their new 6th generation fighter, and they've used an AI image generator to generate a picture, which is terrible. They've left the watermark of a very Western AI generation tool that's being used, and then they've created some sort of fluff around the fact that they're thinking about a sixth generation fighter when clearly they haven't. This is really bad crisis response. So I think that's a really good example of that competitors are moving faster than you are, and you're found,
Mm.
you know, bewildered and left in the dust.
So how do we think? I don't know whether you want to. There's two ways we could go. So we could think about how you deal with these crises, or we could talk about how you prepare for these crises. Which one do you want to do first?
Well, I think it's more logical to talk about how you might prepare, and then when hit with an eventuality, we can then talk perhaps
See,
after the break.
I'm a fan of narrative tension where you describe how terrible things can get and how hard it is to recover, and then you
Well,
redeem yourself by saying, "Of course, if you did these things, it'd be easier." But we can go either way.
I'm always the optimist. So when I'm going to talk about being in a crisis, I'm going to also be quite optimistic about what you can do and how you deal with it. So I think to start with, it's probably worth talking about what you can do before the crisis. And of course, you don't know it's coming. So this isn't preparing for the storm after the weather warning. This is what you can do now in the calm when everything's going well, when the temptation is not to
Well,
expend effort and energy doing it.
you gave me a Paddington stare because I was giving you a Paddington stare. My experience in the civilian world is that I have yet to find a business that has taken preparing for crises seriously.
So
Now,
I have,
I want to be very careful because there are certain aspects of businesses. I'm in the software business where it's almost you do it by habit. So, for example, a thing called disaster recovery,
yeah,
where you practice disaster recovery and you say that system is dead. We will now practice how we resurrect that system somewhere else more
yeah,
safely. So
yeah.
there are, but I think what you're talking about is practicing potentially something more fundamental and unknown.
Yes. So I have worked with companies that have expended quite a lot of effort on these things. Sometimes because they're companies that have been burnt quite badly in the past by not doing it. And so once they've recovered, they've
That's
they've
really
then said,
interesting.
we've learned and now we need to do better. Sometimes it's just organizations that get it. And so there are three things that I do when I work with organizations. I work at integrating new technologies into existing systems. And I'm not a
You were going to say a tech nerd.
I was gonna say a tech nerd. I was gonna actually politely say I'm not a deep technological specialist,
Tech nerd.
but
Embrace it.
I suppose what I have is I have worked with quite a lot of different technologies from the user perspective. And one of the things that I've done and do quite a lot is look at networks of systems and sensor technologies. And the sensors themselves and the technical aspects of those sensors are kind of irrelevant. You can get an expert in to tell you about them. It's more about what do you do with the
It's
information.
the application of
It's the
technology.
application. So I work with companies looking at that. There's a follow on from that, which is I look at understanding and how you generate understanding when you're dealing with systems of systems. So, how do you manage knowledge? How do you manage information flow? How do you manage data? And we've talked in the past about how those are all slightly different things. But analysis is a subjective skill. Data analytics and the maths behind it, probabilities, Bayesian equations, these are objective skills, and it's about forging these things together. And then the final thing is kind of the level above all of this, which we've talked about a lot on this podcast, and is perhaps my sort of hobby horse and passion is decision making on the top layer of all of that, decision making under conditions of uncertainty. So those are the three things that I do when I work with companies. And that takes me in lots of different sectors and looking at lots of different problems. But one of the the things that I always try and do when working with clients is look at not only how can we make what they do now better, how can we make them more efficient, how can we, you know, make their cultures work better, how can we avoid challenges in the future, but also how can we prepare now for when things change, when things go wrong? How can we do management of risk such that when things change, they don't become crises?
I mean, just to go back to this idea of companies that think about this, can you go one level deeper in what makes them different? So you said very clearly, sometimes it's because they had an existential threat. They survived by the skin of their teeth and do it again. But uh, there's such an incentive not to do this. When things are going okay, it's because we're brilliant. And frankly, it's because we're great when a crisis comes along. That must be correct because look how well we're doing. Likewise, there are other organizations that we've watched and we've talked about with the case studies who sleepwalk into crises. You don't
Yeah,
even know. So what is it about? There is a disincentive to spend time and money thinking about something which demonstrably has not yet happened. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing this.
yeah. So a couple of weeks ago, we did an episode on the difference between startups, scale-ups,
Mm.
incumbency, and I think I mentioned at the time the fact that to manage a startup, you need a slightly different set of skills and characteristics than an incumbent organization. And I think I said that actually often startups are creatives. They're people who challenge norms, think differently, whereas large organizations need bureaucratic managers. They need people who can deal with lots of information and keep the balance and keep things going. In my experience, the companies put aside the ones that have been burnt, who are now doing this to either because their insurance companies have told them they have to, or because they've just the lessons are overwhelmingly obvious. Put those aside. A lot of the companies I work with, it's because the person who is in charge of the organization or in charge of that bit of the organization is a dynamic person. They have entrepreneurial spirit. And interestingly, it's the people that are not necessarily that interested in risk management or making sure they've got their arses covered, but actually they want to go after the new thing. And they recognize that in change, there is opportunity. So quite often, the people that are really good at this and that ask to do this in advance are not doing it because they want to make sure that they can keep going when there's a crisis. It's because they don't want to miss the next opportunity.
That is such an important statement. That is so important, which is, I know you just said this, I'm going to say it back almost for myself. Crisis management is not about survival. Crisis management is about thriving. And I think COVID being a really good example, which is everyone else is facing this crisis. Survival is not that interesting.
Yeah,
Actually, you have to thrive in this because you are competing. That's
yeah.
really interesting.
And I've got a good example actually. So there was a company I was working with, and I was talking to their MD, who is also one of the partners, about challenges to the operating environment. I'm not going to say what this company did because I don't know how much they would want me to go public on this, but they were talking about legislative changes that were coming into place as a result of Brexit, EU rules being withdrawn, and what might happen and how they could forecast and do what we were calling at the time pre-mortems, which is analysis of future events and decision trees and lots of stuff like that, wargaming and scenario development. And we got talking about the what if and what could happen if. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, if you remember and cast your minds back to when this was a Chinese issue, this was a novel disease that was happening out in China, and it was just starting to appear in different parts of the world, but in, isolated cases. And this goes back to what I was saying about exponentials. No one was talking, or very few people were talking about this being, in a serious sense, a global pandemic. There was sort of talking the scientific community of this could be nobody in government, nobody in non-medical business spheres were really talking about this. And I said to this guy, what do you think would be the impact if this spreads to Europe? And actually, this business, he came back to me straight away and said, it's already impacting us because this business has a lot of work in China or with China. And one of the first things that was happening were flights were being cancelled to China. And he said, it's already starting to impact us. I said, right, well, have you now done some forecasting on what happens if this is no longer about flights to China being cancelled, but this is flights being cancelled to other parts of the world or globally or yeah, and by the end of the session, we got to what happens if there's a lockdown in the UK. And everybody in the room, except for him, said, never going to happen. This is a waste of time. I mean, there were some really quite vitriolic kind of behaviors because I suggested something so wildly crazy that's never going to happen. And I, at the time, didn't believe it was likely to happen, but I knew it was a possibility.
But it's an interesting psychological statement. I've been in those situations, and I can't say what happened in that situation. Where I've seen in the past is sometimes people say that is such a terrible idea, that would be so catastrophic for us. I'm going to simply discount it.
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it's convenient not to dwell upon it, rather than, well, look, it's an hour.
yeah.
I can spend an hour. That's not it's not a zero chance of it happening. Where you go. Just for because we're coming up to the break. A question for you. We're going to talk straight after the break about how you better prepare for crises, and you've already started to sort of indicate some of the things in terms of looking ahead. Do you think, though, that this is useful as an exercise in itself, even if the crisis doesn't come? So, in other words, does practicing for crises management and the theory behind it and the activity does that make you a stronger business anyway, even if the crisis doesn't happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, without a shadow of a doubt, and I didn't even hesitate there because it does two things. One, it stress tests your current assumptions, your current position, your current decisions against change. Now, I can't tell you when the next crisis is coming. I can't tell you what your next crisis is going to be because I don't know your business. But I can tell you change is normal. Change happens. There will always be change. And stress testing your assumptions and thinking about change makes you a better decision maker. So this company, when we talked about all these different things that could happen, lockdowns in other countries, flights being cancelled, changes to legislation, and then eventually got to this, worst case scenario of a lockdown in the UK. In reality, what I had suggested as very unlikely worst case scenario wasn't actually anywhere near as bad as the extreme of the reality became, but it was good enough. And the second thing it does is it allows you to start to think about a future that is different from now.
As in other words, it doesn't have to be a crisis. It's just what does different potentially look like?
What does different look like? And from that, and as a result of that session, it was about a 4 hour pre-mortem wargaming scenario development session with about 8 of the senior executives from this company, of which 7 were skeptical. I would say 4 were hostile, and 1 was extremely positive and engaged. 2 things happened. This company created some contingency plans, some what if plans, such that if a certain thing happened, that would be the trigger for a decision that needed to be made. And this thing happened quite early on. I think it was the point at which where Italy went into crisis mode. They didn't make an investment that they were going to make for business growth. And even at that time, most of the people in the company were saying, we're overreacting, this is silly, we should just get on and do this. That saved the company about £250,000. This is not a massive company. That's a lot of money to them, which allowed them to have the capital to then deal with the crisis afterward. It also meant they hadn't bought a load of assets that they didn't need, or wouldn't need, as businesses dropped down during the pandemic. But more importantly, in that session, we talked about what they could do to grow in other areas, how they could seize the opportunity. And what that did was it meant that well before lockdowns in the UK happened, the individual I was talking to, who was quite on side and engaged, went out and built a lot of relationships with local government, with local NHS, with local emergency response. And because of the sector that they're in, they didn't really work in those areas, but they could already start to see how they could provide support if there was a national crisis. So they had £250,000 that they hadn't locked into useless assets, and they got relationships so that the moment lockdown happened, they were on the front foot. And compared to their competitors, they swallowed up a whole load of contracts in support of local government because they were ready. So that's a very long answer.
Yeah, no, it's a really good one. Well, look, let's take a quick break, particularly because we have our very own crisis. I can never tell whether the microphones pick up the wine until the edit, but we have run out of wine, and so therefore, because we have previously planned for this,
I was going to say, not a crisis.
It's not a.
We know what the response is.
Exactly. So we're going to take a break. We're going to open another bottle of wine, and we're back in a second. And we'll carry on talking about the kinds of things you can do to think about preparing for crises, whether it's an enormous crisis or whether it's something more tactical and local. See you in a second. Welcome back. Well, a couple of key points from just before we left. First point, we have another bottle of wine. Don't worry, we can carry on. Second point, more importantly, though, which is preparation. As with, unsurprisingly, with all things, thinking about it in advance is highly valuable. And there was a point you made just before we broke, which I didn't pick up on, but is really important, which is eternally when we talk about some of these things like red teaming or preparing for crises, I can imagine there's a bunch of people who roll their eyes and say, this is a week of my life I will never get back. And instead, we've said this with red team, this is also true. You said for this business, they spent 4 hours, and that enabled them, in effect, to ride out a significant crisis that potentially otherwise would have been an existential threat. So this isn't complicated or expensive. This is about, to use the phrase you've used, getting inside the OODA loop on this and saying, we already know what we would do. And there was a point you made, which I thought was really important, which was the business had already identified the key points at which they would make a decision. And again, that's very hard. When a crisis is happening, it's difficult to know when to make the decision. But it sounds like they'd already said, when X happens, we will come in a room and we will say choice A or B or something new because of
exactly that. But it's worth just making the point that we're looking at this retrospectively. So there is a linear path of this eventuality happened, that hit the threshold, so they had to make a decision. They went A or B, they chose B, blah, 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 blah. When we went through that process, we did a lot of branch planning. There was a whole load of decisions that didn't even pop up because the eventualities didn't happen or because they'd gone down a different path. So in hindsight, it looks like you've planned this out as a linear.
Yeah, so it wasn't a plan.
A to B.
It was a set of options.
It was a set of options that narrows down the focus every time the situation changes to say, right, we talked about if this threshold was reached, that threshold has now been reached. And at the time, we said that would be an impact on this investment decision because of, whatever.
So there's an implication here as well, which is what you've just described. Theoretically, any organization could do as it's happening. But I think there's an implication here that when you are in a crisis, there is often it is harder to see where you are or think where you are or make these decisions. In other words, it's this classic thing where we've talked about, it's easy when things are going well, but it's difficult. Something that's simple becomes difficult when things aren't going well. It feels like a similar thing.
Yes, to an extent. I would push back slightly to say, actually, if you are making the decisions in the moment, you have probably lost opportunities. If you think about it in advance, what you end up doing is recognizing before the critical moment the decisions that you might need to make leading up to it. So I'm going to keep going back to this example. The lockdown in Italy happened. That wasn't a critical moment for this company. But because in advance we talked through the potential eventualities, the potential worst case scenarios, we knew, or they knew, that if there was a lockdown in a major European economy that affected their business, Italy just happened to be the one, then that would make the risk threshold higher and would lead to a decision needing to be made. If they hadn't done all of that, Italy would have gone into lockdown and they would still be talking about the fact that this doesn't affect us. So, yes, there is the whole, it's easier to make decisions in the cold light of day before the stress and, not in the moment. But there's also a part of forecasting.
I see what you mean. In other words, I mean, and I don't know if this is the case. Presumably, something like if it's going to happen in Italy, there is a much higher chance that it will happen here,
Yeah.
and we get to act before it happens here because now all of a sudden the chance has increased.
Exactly that. And so this is where I think, talking through some of the things we can do in advance when there isn't a crisis is really, really important. So the first one, we've absolutely talked around already, is anticipation and risk assessment. That's exactly what we were doing. When this guy phoned me up and said, there's this stuff happening in China, we were having a conversation about post-Brexit legislation. It struck me that you might be the right kind of person to help us work through this problem. They were starting to anticipate. The way that you do this, there's nothing in here that's particularly complex or magical. It's all common sense stuff, but you've got to invest early and you've got to think about it. And that's horizon scanning. What does the future look like? What could it look like? And this is where you want to have a broad range of expertise doing this. So it's not just the chief operating officer and the chief financial officer looking at, next year's budget and the accounts and, working based off a strategy vision that's been created. You also need other people who are experts in their field to come in and say, this is how various other factors might affect your world.
I mean, this is a bit of I think I know the answer for obvious reasons in a second. Is it valuable to bring in people from outside the business?
Absolutely.
And the reason why I ask that is not to say the kind of work you do is doubly valuable, but I know as businesses I've worked in, we build our own blind spots.
Yeah.
We build our own premises, we build our own biases, and sometimes it's really important for someone to walk in the room and go, are you all crazy? Can you not see this?
Yeah.
Someone outside can see this where
and I think also this is where, so yes, I'm quite often an external consultant to organizations, but I think when we talk about external help, I'm not really talking about people like me. Actually, I'm talking about deep specialists in a particular field. So I work quite a lot now with companies. I've already mentioned this, in fact, that are looking at future events, courses of action, decisions that need to be made, complexities, as a result of nudges that they've been given by their insurance companies. And that's because insurance companies are very, very good at horizon scanning, forecasting, and doing risk assessment, but mostly because they outsource the actual analysis to various experts across various fields. Here's a really good example. One of the very first episodes we did was on small team leadership, and I talked about my counter-piracy operations. And we talked in that episode about weapons training and preparing for boarding operations and all the tactics. And before I went out to do counter-piracy, I read a book on tuna fishing. And there was a point where quite late at night, I was reading a chapter on how the Japanese fish economy works, thinking, what am I doing? I am wasting my time here. You know, I'm about to go and do counter-terrorism operations in a maritime environment, and I'm reading about the Japanese fish economy. But it turns out, by reading a book about tuna fishing, when I got out into the Indian Ocean, where quite a lot of blue and yellowfin tuna are caught for the Japanese market, I learned about what the process is and what fishing looks like. And I learned about how long fish are in storage, how they have to be stored in order to get the best prices, how long they're kept in ice on containers, how these ships operate. So when I was boarding ships and they were saying, yeah, we're tuna fishermen, I was going, you're not tuna fishermen, which I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So it's a very long-winded way of saying, yeah, this isn't about deep experts telling you that your business is in trouble because your business is being affected by the market. This is about a broad range of expertise that you can now start to map across complex situations.
It was also because you wanted to bring up the counter piracy episode, because you know I don't have stories as good as that, but we'll move on. So forward looking, future
Forward
scanning.
looking, and part of that is scenario planning, red teaming, and we've talked about red teaming in the past, but absolutely stress testing scenarios, because when you go through any kind of strategic planning, there are assumptions about what the future is going to be and therefore where you want to position yourself in that future. If you can have people that can red team that and say, great, get it, get your assumption there, but what if? Or I think we're all collectively starting to assume that this is, you know, the future of artificial intelligence, or we're all this whole strategy works on a premise of, I don't know, US dominance in the chip manufacturing market over the next 3 years. Really specific example, but yeah, if your strategy is based on that assumption and you haven't recognized it, then when that doesn't happen, then you're going to find yourself in a crisis. So having people there to say, have you thought about this? What happens if this happens? Let me throw spears at it in a non-emotional way, in a way that is seen as positive to the team rather than just rubbishing
I
ideas.
wonder whether we've got an episode coming where we actually red team an idea.
Yeah,
Because I think
we should do that.
we've talked about it a lot, but actually, how do you do it? And it's another one of these things: is it really complicated? No, actually, it's practical, and we can break down a structure.
Yeah.
And that should do it. But anyway, so red teaming.
Yeah, and from that, you should then be able to start to identify key indicators, key things that are going to show that assumptions are starting to become undone or being reinforced, that certain courses of action that you've identified as possibilities are potentially more likely. And this is the, Italian lockdown was just an indicator.
It's going back to the sales world, which is, and I've been in a scenario where we had a competitor that had 90% market share. And over time, we managed to change that to 10% market share. But there's a really good, that would have been a good thing for that competitor to say, how do we know when we are being attacked and they are being effective? Because of course, when there's a competitor, you say, well, we'll be better than them. And this next release will keep us ahead of them.
Yeah.
But there's a really good question. What is the indicator that we have to take this seriously?
And importantly, on those indicators, at what point do you need to make a decision? Because
and what are the leading indicators rather than the lagging indicators?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an important point here, which is anyone who's ever been involved in, stocks and shares or any kind of um, speculative investments will know that objective decision making is very, very difficult to do in the moment when the share price is, crashing, because you want to get out before you lose all your money, or when it's going up and you want to jump in and ride that. But of course, objectively, we know we should buy shares when they're crashing, when they're low, and we should sell them when they're high. But emotion takes over. So in advance, when you've identified indicators, at what point does that trigger the need for a decision? And you can, in advance, talk about what are the factors that are going to affect that decision. So you can be more objective in the moment. The next point is really important, which we've talked about before, is resilience building. And that's organizational resilience, team resilience, as well as redundancy. So we've done a whole episode, so I'm not going to go into resilience in too much detail, but redundancy is an important aspect because we're always looking for savings measures. We're always looking to see how we can be more efficient. But redundancy is counter to that. And this is perhaps why people don't want to get too involved in crisis management, because it means they have to go to their bosses and say, I'm holding a bit back, or we need to hold a bit back, or we need to think about if this goes wrong, how we're going to respond. And that means you might then have to go to your boss and present some slightly less,
Well, let me give you a really real world example, which I think everyone faces every day, irrespective of whether there is a crisis, and that is succession planning. So succession planning says when person X leaves, do we have a plan? Yes, they could be backfilled for a temporary period of time in this way. We would then go out and hire, or this, if this person left, we would fill them with this person, backfill. I think that is a really, really good example. Part of that isn't about holding back, but part of that is when that happens, if that person gets a great new job and goes, if you don't have a plan, that can very quickly become a crisis,
yeah,
particularly when they're more senior. And so having that, what would I do, is a really, really good example. And you should be doing that before there's a crisis. In fact,
yeah,
even if things are fantastic when people leave, you should be thinking about that. And I think that's a really good example of the most simple and obvious planning you would do, irrespective of a crisis. And actually, most organizations are pretty poor at that kind of thing. I
yeah,
just, people listening today, if key members of your team left tomorrow, do you know what you would do?
yeah,
Or do you say, oh, I'd have to sit down and think, what do I do now?
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really important. Communication is really important in a crisis, but you need to plan for that. So you need to have a good understanding of how you will quickly pass information around. And depending on the crisis, the crisis itself might impact on your ability to communicate. COVID was a really good example of that. A national lockdown meant that suddenly we were all having to do all of our communications virtually over Zoom meetings, Teams calls, telephone calls. The office meetings, just stopped happening
Well,
overnight.
everyone panicked and had to buy Zoom.
Yeah,
That's, and as opposed to the organization that said, we have cameras, we have internet connections,
yeah,
we know what we're going to do. By the way, again, going all the way to the other end of the spectrum, when you, one of these software outages, and sadly, it's a fact of life these days. In fact, let's use CrowdStrike as an example. CrowdStrike happened, if I remember rightly, on a Thursday or a Friday night.
yeah,
Okay, name me an organization, and I hope that some of the people listening will be that organization who knew when that type of existential threat happens, we will meet every 5 hours until it's resolved, as opposed to when are we going to meet? What are we going to do? No,
yeah,
the plan is in that situation, these people will meet every 5 hours until these things happen. So it's what I love about this, as always, is it's all very, very simple and it doesn't take long to plan it. But what you get if you do that in advance is massive. The terrible thing happens, and you're
Yeah,
like, well, we all know who's coming on the phone. We all know what we're going to do. Hell, we even have an agenda
yeah,
to go through. We don't have to burn any energy organizing ourselves. We can devote all of our energy on the problem.
yeah. And I think another aspect of crisis, and a cyber attack on an organization or an infrastructure, is a really good example of this. But it could be wildfires,
Yeah.
it could be a pandemic.
Yes, exactly.
A a crisis is likely to have twofold impact on your organization. One, your ability to operate and do whatever it is you do, the widgets you make, telling people, to sell more or buy more or whatever. Whatever it is you do as an organization will be impacted by the nature of the fact that this is a crisis. The individuals in your organization will also be impacted. And so when we talk about communication, this is internal communication and external communication. How are you as a business, when things are going badly, maintaining your brand? How are you not looking like, and there are plenty of political crises that we can use as examples, that actually the first crisis was just bad luck or just an uncontrollable event. The subsequent mismanagement of that crisis, of the communication, led to exacerbation of that, in some cases, downfalls of governments. So there is an external communications challenge that you need to have thought about and prepared for upfront. And then there is internal, people are affected by these things. You might have to make really difficult decisions about job cuts. You might have to make decisions about budget cuts. You might be cutting projects. You might be telling people they have different responsibilities or a different way of working or are working in different teams. So managing people internally through clear communication, through honesty and transparency about the rationale behind the decisions is just as important as actually dealing with the chip pan fire in the corner.
It occurred to me as well, and I'm thinking back to some of the crises I've worked through. There is a group of people who you will call together to deal with the crises. Actually, something we've never done, I've never seen, is who told everyone else, keep doing what you're doing, keep the lights on,
Yeah,
because these people are dealing with the crisis. And more than that, there are fewer of you now. So actually, one of your responsibilities is to cover for the guys dealing with the crises. But whether or not that's particularly important in your business, I don't know. But as we've gone through this, hopefully what you've seen is there's some pretty simple conversations over a beer on a Friday night at 5 o'clock, and someone writes it down. And when these crises happen, you go from saying, what do we do? And the shock, and I think we haven't talked about the word shock, but shock has a huge impact on these things.
yeah,
But when you all of a sudden have a piece of paper that you can pick up that's laminated that says, these are the 5 things you do, it's very easy. I'm going to make the point actually about shock, because we've kind of implied that when something happens, everyone's ready to go. When I'm going to do a war story, it's a crap war story, but it's okay. When I was in the Royal Navy, one of the things we trained for was escape and evasion and survival.
yeah.
And there was a particular phase which at the time was called conduct after capture.
Still is.
Is that what they
Yeah.
then? No, it's conduct after capture now. It used to be called resistance to interrogation.
Yeah.
And everyone said that's a terrible thing. That's not. Anyway, the point that was made was, in a scenario where a member of the military is captured, if you want to interrogate them, that is the time to do it, because there is shock,
Yeah.
there is discombobulation, there is disruption, there is dislocation. People are better able to, as it were, protect themselves. And so therefore the big deal was made. If you are shot down in an aircraft, this is what we're being trained, be very aware when you are, if you've been captured, you need to be almost even more vigilant at the beginning
Yeah.
because it's harder. Okay, that's a very dramatic statement to make, and I've got some fantastic war stories, which maybe for another time. But that goes the same. If someone walks in the room and says the system is down,
Yeah.
we don't know why it's down, all our customers are down, and the phones are lighting up, actually, there is your example about how it's harder to react because that is someone has just shown you existential threat that you were not expecting. So don't this planning isn't just for fun, isn't just a well, we've saved 5 minutes for the day. This planning is so that when you are potentially institutionally going through this shock,
Yeah.
you can actually be effective in minute one. Whereas normally you might be sitting there shell shocked for 20 minutes going, crap, what are we going to do?
And I think that's a really visceral and good example of how crisis affects people. I think also worth recognizing that a lot of these decisions feel like they're going to be made in boardrooms by executives, but it's information that comes from people. And these people might be being affected by the very crisis that is affecting the organization. So the next thing, we've run out of time, unfortunately. So this will be my last point. But I want to talk about decision making under pressure, which is my absolute passion and hobby horse. How do you make decisions in complexity? How do you do it when everything around you seems lost and you don't see the way out? And the reality is you can practice. You can practice and you can prepare and you can train and you can simulate these kind of situations, but you can red team where these pressure points are going to be. And the really important thing to recognize here is up to date and accurate information is really, really important in the early stages of crisis response. And you're not going to get that if you haven't thought about it in advance. And if you haven't then told people what you've thought about in advance and practiced it, because it was probably going to be the night manager who's monitoring the phones, in the off hours remotely, who's going to be your point person who's got the most up-to-date information. It might be that the people you rely on for data don't have access because, the wildfire or the cyber attack or whatever it is means that they're offline. So knowing where you can get information, where you can get verified, accurate information so that you're not defaulting back to those human heuristics of, well, I'm just going to go off gut instinct because the chances are your gut instinct isn't ready for this crisis. Because if it was, this wouldn't be a crisis. And perhaps more importantly, you might not be the best person to make the decision because of the situation. So where you would normally be that person, this might be a time to delegate, or it might be a time for people who don't have the wider context of what's going on, but do have the up-to-date information, are empowered to make local decisions. And now we're back to our old friend of mission command. All of these things are going to be context dependent. It's going to be situationally dependent. It's going to depend on what it is you do and how you do it. But the key point is you need to think about it in advance and you need to practice, you need to red team, you need to have foresight, you need to allocate capability and capacity to deal with these things. And then more importantly, and I think this is an episode we should come on to, is what do you then do to seize the opportunity? Because in all crisis, and I think it's a Barack Obama administration quote about every crisis presents opportunity. Every crisis creates change, change creates turmoil, turmoil creates winners and losers.
Well, and I have a very real example of that because again, I bet there's people thinking, what do you mean there's opportunity? The example you gave in COVID, that wasn't us. I worked in a company where we had a catastrophic period of downtime.
Yeah.
And it was a significant period of catastrophic downtime. One might argue there was no possible opportunity in that. In fact, It was, and it genuinely was, an existential threat to the business. Following that, the executive team met with individual customers, were honest, were transparent, explained what had happened, explained what they were going to do. And most of the exec, talking to them afterwards, agreed our relationship with our customers became stronger after that.
Yeah.
Counterintuitively, the customer should be seethingly angry. And instead, they said, you have demonstrated in a period of crisis what you will do to support our business and the thoughtfulness behind it. So
Yeah.
I think that's really good. We've come to the end of this one. It's another one of those classic episodes where we start off thinking, well, it's about an hour. We'll come back. I think that's really good, which is we've talked about some of the things. Well, we've talked about sort of this conceptual idea of crisis. We've talked about what you can do to prepare. Next time we'll come back and say, what do you do when the crisis hits? And as we've said, how do you turn that into an opportunity and successfully deal with a crisis? I want each, it gets very demanding, you can't see, but I'm pointing at the computer that's recording this. I want each and every person who is listening to this episode to think about what preparing for a crisis means for them and for their business. What we have very clearly said is this is not an expensive, this is not a time-consuming process. Depending on what you mean by a crisis, what's the crisis in your context, this could be something as simple as getting a group of people together with a whiteboard for a couple of hours, doing some very simple things. So go do that.
Yeah.
And it's nothing that a few beers and a pizza on a Friday night wouldn't pay for. Please go do that. We're now into the final bit. If you've listened to us before, you know this. Please subscribe. Please tell a friend. battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. battlingwithbiz on X. We would love for you to share what we're doing here if you found this interesting. There are many, many episodes. If you find what we're doing interesting, please go and look at previous episodes because there's a lot going on. And we've said this so many times and we'll say it again. We hope this is interesting and stimulates some ideas. The value comes, though, when you talk to other people. I hope there are 1,000 conversations that will be triggered tomorrow because you will have said to a colleague, maybe we should do something more about red teaming if there's a crisis. That's what this is all about.
If that is the case and you do have those conversations, then the only thing we ask is that you promote our podcast and recommend it to the people that you work with and your friends and colleagues. And we hope to see you next week here on Battling with Business.
And on that note, we will go and find another bottle of wine because our crisis wasn't over as early as we thought at the break. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next week on Battling with Business.
Cheerio.